So this is, as I said, our 5th lesson in the study of Gideon in the book of Judges. So, you know, we've had this picture of Gideon. We met him when he was kind of hunkered down in the wine press, trying to thresh wheat for food because his people were close to starving. And then we saw him involved in tearing down the altar to Baal. This is the pagan god that everybody had started to worship. But he's not brave enough. Remember, he wasn't brave enough to do it in the daylight. So he did it, took about 10 of his men with him and did it at night. And then we saw God calling him to lead his people in battle against the Midianites, which is kind of like, oy, you know, it's like no good deed goes unpunished. And now he's being asked to lead against the Midianites. And I think nobody was as surprised as Gideon was when God told him to do that. And so he's kind of alarmed and worried about that. And what does he do? He asks for this very famous sign from God because he's just not quite sure, is this really God calling me? And, you know, I think we've all been there. I think we talked about this, you know, you feel like, you know, this is God leading me, but is it really, or is it my own kind of imagination? Am I really feeling led by God, or you know, is it really God? And so he asks for this is the famous fleece episode, or the 2 episodes, wet or dry. He's testing God to make sure that Gideon is really the guy who's supposed to be leading the army of Israel against the enemy. I think Gideon would have been very happy if the fleece test had failed, and he could have said, oh, too bad, you know, I thought it was supposed to be me, but it's not. So, you know, Fred, you go do it. And then to make matters even, you know, it just kind of goes from bad to worse for Gideon, if you want to look at it that way. Last week we saw God reducing Gideon's army, 32,000, which sounds like a lot of men, able-bodied men, goes from 32,000 to 300 men. 300 men to go against this mighty army of Midianite warriors. And now the scene is set for what we're going to talk about today. These men are in their room, in their tents. It's the night before what is going to be this great battle, and everybody's kind of waiting for the fight. So it's a little bit like a roller coaster with Gideon. Do you sense that? It's kind of up and down and up and down. And, you know, he's confident, and then he's scared, and then he's brave, and then he's cowardly. And I thought, you know, it's just kind of very normal. You know, it's normal, the way any normal person would be under the circumstances. And I thought you can really relate to how Gideon has felt through what we've studied. Made me think of our lives in 2020. I mean, our lives in the last 6 months, 7 months, have been rather a roller coaster ride too, haven't they? I don't think Gideon has anything on any of us this year. We've been up and down, we've been quarantined, we've been banished from restaurants, we've been hidden or hiding in our own homes, hoping the electricity and the internet don't go out. I mean, you know, we're all worried about, you know, when it's hot like it is and now and has been, you know, hope the power doesn't go out, the air conditioning doesn't go out. But not to mention the fact that in California, we've got fires and blackouts. Other parts of the country have, in LA, downtown LA, we have violence in the streets, Portland. I have a friend who lives in Portland, and she said it's just horrifying. Really? You can't leave your house. I mean, she lives close enough to where all the stuff is going on, the rioting and the protesting, that she's really staying in her house. And I'm sure Gideon must have felt the same way. It's just when when the bottom comes out of the security of your life, you know, you feel very unstable. You feel very shaken. So no wonder Gideon wanted to make sure God was behind what was going to happen. He didn't want to venture out on his own. I think what he's experiencing is very normal. I think any other time reading the text of Judges 6 and 7, I would have said, oh, come on, Gideon, be a man, you know, take charge, do what you're being asked to do, and stop being a wimp. But after living through the last 6 months or so, you know, I'm much more understanding of Gideon's hesitation, his unwillingness to just plunge into something without some kind of assurance or reassurance that God is guiding him. I think, again, when the pegs come out from under you, more so do you want to make sure that God is really behind your next steps. And I think watching somebody else experiencing something of your own confusion and misery can lead you to be more understanding of someone else's hesitation. Do you all kind of shake your head, nod your heads if you agree? It's the phenomenon called walking a mile in someone else's shoes. I think it's easy for us when that hasn't happened to be very flippant, very cavalier about what someone else is experiencing and say, well, why doesn't she just, you know, just do it, just grow up, just, you know, go do it. But sometimes you have to kind of experience it yourself, the trauma, the insecurity, to be able to say, okay, I get it. So here we are, 8 verses into chapter 7 of Judges. And Gideon has seen his army cut back to 300 men for some pretty amazing reasons. You know, we saw that last week. Men who are fearful, they're sent home, which eliminated 22,000 of them, which says most of them were fearful. And again, it's understandable why they were fearful. They were probably going to die in the battle, considering the odds, you know. Then the remaining men were culled because of, remember we talked about how to drink water from the brook or the stream or whatever, the body of water. The ones that got down on their hands and knees and stuck their faces in the water and lapped the water like dogs, gone, go home. Because they were not thought to be by God, thought to be alert. Whereas the ones that were just kind of crouched down and cupped water, and that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? When you think about it, the ones who cupped water were able to kind of look around. They could drink, but they were also able to be alert for the enemy to approach. So 300 in Gideon's army, against which we now know was 135,000 in the army of their enemies, the Midianites and the Amalekites and some other ites from neighboring tribes of their enemies. Have you guys kind of thought about that? Those odds, 300 to 135,000? It's kind of mind-boggling when you think about it. And this is where Judges 7:9 picks up from last week. So it says it happened on the same night. And it's interesting to me that this is a really long night for Gideon. It's like it goes out of the text says it happened on the same night that the Lord said to him, "Arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand." Interesting. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you shall hear what they say, and afterwards your hands shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Now I want to stop in the middle of that verse 11, because I think we need to recognize something again, this is one of those little verses, this little passage that often goes unrecognized in the, both in the study of Gideon and in a bigger kind of a 30,000-foot study of God's grace and generosity to us. As I've studied this, I've thought, why isn't this passage used more often when people teach about God's grace and God's mercy to us? And you'll see, I think, as we talk about it, what I mean. And I think in this study of Gideon, I have been really amazed and really blessed that there are so many occurrences where something that's rather enormous like this just kind of slides by, unless we pay attention to it, or unless our attention is drawn to it. So this is one of those, and we're going to unpack it to see what I'm talking about. You know, God moves differently in different people's lives, doesn't he? He doesn't move in my life the way he might in yours. When a man, or even say a little boy, a young boy, is brave and fearless, God seems to need to do about whether or not he's the right person for that job. And I'm going to give you a great illustration of that in Scripture. David the shepherd boy, who at a young age, he probably is 16 or maybe even younger, he sees the Israelite army camped against the Philistines, another big enemy of the Israelites, the Philistines, particularly the giant Goliath. You all know this, again, one of the most studied, if you grew up going to Sunday school, if you had kids in Sunday school, the story of David and Goliath is kind of one of the iconic stories. David wants to be the one to do battle against him. This story is found in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And David, none of the Israelites, King Saul is the head of the army, and nobody in the Israelite army wants to fight Goliath. Do you remember that? They're all just kind of parked out on the fields, and everybody's just kind of come to a complete standstill. And Goliath is taunting the Israelite army and just kind of threatening them, and everybody's just kind of, you know, they're just kind of frozen. And David has come, his brothers are a part of the Israelite army, so he has come to bring them some sustenance, some food, and he sees what's going on, and he gets really ticked off. Remember that? So he gets mad, and he kind of says, I'll fight him. Let me go fight Goliath. And everybody kind of goes, who is this little whippersnapper? In verse 32 of 1 Samuel chapter 17, David says to King Saul, he goes right up, this is a little shepherd boy. This is a nobody. He goes up to the king, to King Saul. He asks the king if he can go fight Goliath. Even though no one else in the Israelite army has the courage to do battle against Goliath. In verse 32, David says to King Saul, don't worry about this Philistine. I'll go fight him. Now, that's pretty audacious. He's saying to the king of the the nation of Israel, first king of Israel, who's this very prepossessing, you know, Saul was very tall, very handsome, you know, stood out in a crowd because of his height and because of his good looks, which apparently was all he had going for him. As is true so often with so many men. Oh, that was nasty. I shouldn't say that. I don't mean that. Delete that. But don't be ridiculous, Saul replied. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth. So Saul has a fairly logical argument. And then David utters one of my favorite lines in the entire Bible, not just the Old Testament, but also the New. I love this line. one that I love to hear and that resonates with our lesson this morning. In verse 26 of 1 Samuel chapter 17, it says, "Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, 'What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel?'" And then this amazing question, this is the part I love, that should stir your blood and your very soul, comes out of David's young mouth and heart. "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God?" Isn't that a great verse? And by the way, translations do matter. And that last line, that most wonderful line, you have to read it in the New American Standard Bible, because it usually reads defy, that he should defy the armies of the living God. And I think it's got to say taunt. My degree is in British literature, so I'm steeped in poetry. And the way that is phrased, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt? See, the word taunt just smacks. It's just a great word, that he should taunt the armies of the living God. Do you just see how it resonates with David saying, who is this Goliath that the armies of God himself, of the living God, should be taunted and should be afraid of this giant? I'm not afraid of him. I just get chills when I hear that verse. To me, that verse is just amazing. The bravado, the courage that David exhibits. And there's no prompting from God. All of that to say, I just think that's such a great, I had to teach a little bit about that, because that's such a great passage. And the point is, where is God? He's nowhere. He's not there whispering in David's ear. He hasn't told David to do anything. This is all from this young boy on his own, without signs or fleeces or any outside stimulus. This is a young man of utmost courage and determination. Now, we're going to see, if you study the life of David, plenty of flaws in the years to come. So, but right now, God is a bit hands off when it comes to working with David, right? You see my point? But over and over again, since we met Gideon in chapter 6, we see God bending over backwards, metaphorically speaking, to oblige Gideon, to accommodate his fears and his concerns, because God understands what he's going through. And I got to thinking, that's the way God is with all of us. He knows when you're at a point where he can take his hands off of you and just let you be you and do your thing. And he knows when he needs to come into your life and work with you and speak to you clearly. And I just think it's such a great picture of how God works. He knows that Gideon is overwhelmed with, it's daunting to see the Midianites. They're so numerous. Remember, we saw he's up on a hill. He's looking out in this valley where the Midianite tents are pitched. And if you've got 135,000 men, there's got to be a lot of tents, right? I mean, let's figure 2-3 guys per tent. Do the math. That's a lot of tents. So he's looking out over these tents. He's got 300 men who are farmers and simple folk. And remember, they don't have weapons. They don't have spears and swords. They've got pitchforks and sticks. They don't have, they don't have much of anything. So God gets why Gideon is so apprehensive. He gets it. And that's a trait, a characteristic of God that we always need to be aware of and grateful for. He doesn't just throw us out there and say, fend for yourself, suck it up. He protects us. He shields us even from ourselves. He bends graciously and meets us where we are. He knows that each of us, each person is different, and requires different things from him. And he goes along with us when we ask for a sign, like water on a fleece or water around a dry fleece. And he's patient and long-suffering. But what he asks for in return is that we trust him. When we ask for these signs and he says, okay, I will do these signs for you, then we have to trust him. And he knows that Gideon is probably sitting there looking down at that valley and thinking to himself, there's no way we can defeat that army with these men that I have. So God's going to give Gideon some more help, because that's how his grace and his mercy and his compassion work in Gideon's lives and often in our lives. So I wanted you to see the contrast between David and Gideon. So David faces this giant Goliath when everyone else is terrified, even the mighty Israelite army, and he's not daunted one bit. And so God is nowhere to be seen in this chapter, 1 Samuel chapter 17. He lets David do his thing because he knows David is up to the task. But Gideon is unsure, he's tenuous, he doesn't feel confident at all. So God is right in the midst of things in Gideon's life. And notice even the wording of God sending Gideon into the Midianite camp. And I love this. He says, arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand. In verse 9, right off the bat, God is promising Gideon victory. Go down into the Midian camp. Something will happen there secretly, and know that you will be victorious. You don't know yet how it's going to happen, Gideon, but the end result is that you and your 300 men are going to be victorious. But if you are afraid to go down, because he also knows, because I know that you are afraid. He says, if you are afraid to go down, the if is, God is saying, but come on, let's be serious. I know you're afraid to even do that, which is understandable. He's saying to Gideon, go down into the enemy camp, sneak down there. And Gideon's thinking, you're kidding. You want me to do that? Because he realizes what would happen if he were to get caught. He would be killed. Take your trusted servant Purah with you, and you shall hear what they say. And afterwards your hands shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Now, God doesn't tell him exactly what he's going to hear when he sneaks into the Midianite camp, but he promises that it will be something that will change his mind about the upcoming battle's outcome. So let's just stop for a second and pay attention to the message from God to Gideon. Again, I think sometimes we tend to read these passages and we just gloss over them, and we don't stop to think of the import of them. He says, go down into the camp of the Midianites and don't be afraid, because you are going to win against them. I have delivered the Midianites into your hand. So again, it's God saying, I'm in charge. I'm in control. He's trying to keep Gideon calm and assured that nothing will happen to him. Number one, when he sneaks into the camp. And again, he's saying, take Purah, your servant, with you for reassurance and backup, because obviously if you have somebody with you, you're more comfortable than if you do it by yourself. Now, I'm assuming that's why he wanted to take him with, because psychologically two are better than one. And the two of you will hear what two of the Midianites are whispering to each other in their tent. And you will be reassured about what's going to happen. Your hand will be strengthened against your enemy. So all of this God communicates to Gideon to send him secretly sneaking into the Midianite camp in the dead of night with his servant. This is God, again, acting with such mercy and grace and tenderness toward Gideon, knowing what his issues are and protecting him while still sending him on the mission. Because he knows that this, I mean, God could have done this in so many other ways, couldn't he? He could have just said, look, Gideon, you're going to win the battle. I've promised it to you, so just calm down. I was trying to think, why did God say, this is what you need to do? You need to take Purah with you. You need to sneak down and go into the camp. And it's never explained why. I mean, it's just kind of the mysterious way God works. And if you've ever had God work in your life at some time, and you still to this day say, I don't know why that happened, but that's the way God worked in that time in my life, you probably will never know the why, but it worked. He knows that this mission will actually make Gideon secure in his knowledge of his victory over the enemy. So he's pushing him to do this hard thing, sneaking into the camp, into enemy territory in the dead of night, but he's doing it in the best possible way. And that's how God works in our lives so often. So the second half of verse 11, then he, Gideon, went down with Purah, his servant, to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp. So again, very risky venture. Sneaking in, the two of them, in the middle of the night with the intention of listening in on the conversations that might be taking place in the tents of the enemy. Now, if they were caught, they would be killed. I have no doubt. And I'm sure they didn't. They had no doubt of that either. So verse 12 continues the story. Now the Midianites and Amalekites, all the people of the east, were lying in the valley, as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as the sand by the seashore in multitude. Now, this is a literary technique called hyperbole, which is exaggeration to make a point. The point here being there were lots and lots of people, as numerous as locusts, and lots of camels, as numerous as the sand by the seashore. And this is all telling us that the enemy is mighty and many. So it's, it's kind of saying they're sneaking down in the dead of night to the enemy camp where there are lots of them. There's like, it's scary. It's to confirm how frightening this is. And the text goes on. And when Gideon had come, there was a man telling a dream to his companion. He said, I have had a dream. To my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. It came to a tent and struck it so that it fell and overturned, and the tent collapsed. Then his companion answered and said, this is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. Now we need to stop right here and marvel at the story as it's told in verses 12 to 14. Here we have Gideon and Purah. I mean, the story just gets more and more amazing. They're sneaking into the camp, and remember that there are probably thousands of tents housing 135,000 soldiers. They just happen to sneak up and wait outside the tent of two men who are awake and having a conversation. And one man is relating a dream he has had to the other guy. So, okay, you mathematicians, what are the chances that this would happen? I'd say 1 in 135,000, since that's the number of soldiers. But let's say there were 2 to a tent, so you divide that by 2. So let's say 1 in 67,500, that they would hit the very tent where this conversation is going on with these two men. They land right outside the tent of a guy who has had this ominous dream that he wants to share with his tent mate, that it's going to give Gideon the confidence that he needs to go back and win the battle. Now, don't you think this is pretty amazing? What are the chances? The other thing about this encounter is this: a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. It came to a tent and struck it so that it fell and overturned and the tent collapsed. Well, that to me is a definite dream, letting these guys know that Gideon is going to win the battle, don't you think? Really? To me, it has nothing to do with anything. I mean, what does a loaf of barley bread knocking down a tent have to do with Gideon winning the battle? I just think what it is in the mind of this guy who had the dream, it was something that God put in his mind that to him was a sign that they were going to lose the battle, that Gideon and his 300, now hold that thought because he doesn't know it's 300. This could have been a dream about any number of things. What does a loaf of barley bread have to do with, does any of you think of the relationship to the loaf of barley bread knocking over a tent and being completely identifiable with the Midianites losing the battle to the Israelites? I mean, if you can think of something, let me know, because I could not find any correlation.
Maybe the farmers, something to do with the farmers versus the soldiers, that people who worked the land were actually the people that God was going to honor.
Yeah, that's kind of a stretch, but yeah, I guess yeah, I mean, a loaf of bread is not something that's common only to, yeah.
I thought barley was like a tough grain, like it's not ideal.
Yeah, I did some searching. I could not find any rationale for this to be, just a definitive, this is definitely Gideon and his army. Now, remember that we're going to talk about something else. So just hold that thought. So this self-appointed interpreter, the guy that he's telling the dream to, says, this is nothing else. Notice the language. This is nothing else but the sword of Gideon. I mean, he's just absolutely, he's not wavering. He's not waffling. He's not saying, well, it could be this, it could be that. This is nothing else but the sword of Gideon. Gideon doesn't even have a sword. What sword? This is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand, God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. Now remember, these are not men who believe in Jehovah God. These are men who worship Baal. So this is an amazing statement for this dude. So he's referring to Jehovah God and saying that God has given Gideon the victory over the Midianites when the battle will take place at daylight. And the wording in the original Hebrew says, this is nothing else. There is no other interpretation but this. Other translations of Judges 7:14 are, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon. Or the New Living Translation says, your dream can mean only one thing. God has given Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite, victory over Midian and all its allies. So this is nothing else but God breathing into the soul of this man and speaking what God wanted Gideon to hear. That's what this is. With this definitive, nothing else could be but this. Think of the ways this could have gone, but didn't. This could have gone in so many different directions. Two men whispering to each other in what appears to be the dead of night before a major battle. They could have been saying, you know, this is going to be a wipeout. We outnumber, we're going to win this battle in half an hour. We outnumber them. We are soldiers and they are not. You know, they're farmers. We have weapons. They don't. We have camels and they don't. Instead, what Gideon and Purah hear is this plain and simple acknowledgement that the Midianites are going to be defeated at the hands of the Israelites. All 300 of them. The two men in the tent who are saying this have no idea how small the Israelite army has become. That's another thing. They don't know what we know. We already know that the Israelite army has been pared down from 32,000 to 300. So this is plain and simple, a setup and a sign for Gideon to gain his courage and his ability to go back and lead these 300 men. So what's the reaction then on Gideon's part? Look at verse 15. And this is a great verse. And so it was when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation that he worshiped. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, "Arise, for the Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand." I love this verse, and we need to stop and dwell on it for a minute, lest we neglect or ignore or downplay its importance. What did he do first of all when he heard these two men whispering in their tent in the middle of the night? He worshiped. He stopped and worshiped. He stopped to give thanks to God for this blessing, this mercy, his grace to God, to get his grace to Gideon once again in the midst of this frightening situation. This is exactly what God wanted to happen. He wanted Gideon's faith increased to the point that he came back to the camp of his people, that he worshiped God, and then he roused his 300 men and told them that God had given the enemy into their hands. And he doesn't say into my hands, he says into your hands, into our hands. He must have spoken now with such authority, such faith, such purpose, because there wasn't a doubt among these 300. They knew in their hearts now that they were going to be victorious. And this is no small thing, ladies. This is a big deal. 300 men now against 135,000 men. And now God can really work in all of these 300 men. And I thought, you know, have I ever had an experience where I felt God's presence and assurance so overwhelmingly that I knew no matter what the circumstances looked around me, that he was with me and that he was for me? Because that's really what's happening here. These guys, it doesn't matter to them how many men were in the Midianite army. It doesn't matter how many camels or what their weaponry was like. Now these people have this assurance that God is with them. But here's another thing. Gideon is not so spiritually minded that he can't be practical. He knows that he must give real instructions to his men. So he's become a real leader. He's not just saying, well, you know, I got this dream from God, and I know that we're going to win, so I guess we just kind of go do it. There's real instructions to what he does next. It says, then he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put a trumpet into every man's hand with empty pitchers and torches inside the pitchers. And he said to them, Look at me and do likewise. Watch, and when I come to the edge of the camp, you shall do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then you also blow the trumpets on every side of the whole camp, and say, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. This is Gideon's battle plan, and it sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? Where do you suppose he got this plan, complete with pitchers and torches and trumpets? And remember last week, we discovered that they weren't trumpets. Picture, that's not what they were. They were not trumpets in the orchestra. They were, look at this, Amazon. Whoa, it's disappearing. $10 on Amazon. This is a shofar. So I'm going to blow it for you. That's what it was. This is a plastic, really cheapo $10 shofar. You can actually buy a shofar on Amazon. I mean, you can buy anything on Amazon. It was actually, that's a shofar, which is a Jewish instrument made from a ram's horn or plastic in this case. It was used in religious ceremonies, but it was also used as a battle signal to call people to battle. And the Jewish men wore them around their waist. They just kind of hung on their belts. So what they would do is it made a loud sounding noise, and you could call people to battle. They had 300 shofars easily, because remember all the people that they sent home? So they could say, hey, Bernie, give me your shofar before you leave. So they had a lot of shofars. That was not a problem. Remember last week I said, you know, where did they get 300 trumpets? They weren't trumpets, they were shofars. But they didn't have weapons and swords and spears, so they worked with what they had, and we're going to see what they did. I'm assuming here that God gave Gideon not only the courage and the faith, but this battle plan. He wouldn't have given him the first two without the battle plan to carry out against the enemy. So verses 19 to 25 continue. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him, so he's one of the three sections, came to the outpost of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just as they had posted the watch. And they blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers that were in their hands. Then the three companies blew the trumpets, or the shofars, and broke the pitchers. They held the torches in their left hand and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing, and they cried, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And every man stood in his place all around the camp. So what they did is they spread the 300 men as much as they could around the Midianite camp to make it look like it was a lot more men. That's a great technique, a great tactic. That's why I lost my place in the text. And every man stood in his place all around the camp, and the whole army ran and cried out and fled. That's the Midianite army. It scared them to death. So they did this while the Midianite army was unprepared. They were kind of still sleeping in the middle watch, which is kind of like from 10 to midnight. They were still asleep. So they fled. When the 300 blew the trumpets or shofars, the Lord set every man's sword against his companion throughout the whole camp. They're killing each other. I mean, this is something that happens a lot in the Old Testament when God goes in to fight for the Israelites. The armies of the enemies slay each other. It's kind of, you know, God's plan. The army fled to Beth Acacia towards Zerera, as far as the border of Abel Meholah by Tabith. I have no idea where those places are, but they fled. And the men of Israel gathered together from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh. So all the outlying tribes now, of course, now they come, you know, when it looks like victory is at hand, here come all the little outlying tribes, Naphtali, Asher, and the rest of Manasseh. Those are all some of the smaller tribes of Israel. And they pursued the Midianites. Then Gideon sent messengers throughout all the mountains of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and seize from them the watering places as far as Beth Barah and the Jordan. Then all the men of Ephraim gathered together and seized the watering places as far as Beth Barah and the Jordan. And they captured 2 princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. They pursued Midian and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of the Jordan. So this is your battle stuff. Now, this is full of information. Gideon breaks up his huge army of 300 men into 3 companies and does this very strategic thing. The middle watch is the middle of the night. Usually, I'm sorry, it's midnight to about 8 a.m. The most likely time for the soldiers to be sleeping. Again, this is very strategic from a military standpoint. And as we've said numerous times, Gideon is not a military thinker. This is God helping him, putting this in his head. So it's very strategic to begin with. Let's attack when they're still asleep, as opposed to when they're up and, have all their gear on and their weapons ready. And the new watchmen, the new guards have just been posted. Everything's in a bit of a muddle. He doesn't attack with a view to killing as many of the Midianites as he can. That would be rather foolish, wouldn't it? So each of his 300 men, what are they holding in their hands? They've got a shofar, and each man blows the shofar loud and clear. And this is a really junky one, but those shofar make a really loud noise. If you've ever heard a real one, it's kind of ear-piercing. And in their other hand was a pitcher, a ceramic pitcher. And he had them break the pitcher with a resounding thud. And they held their torches up high. Why? What did the shofars and the pitchers and the torches accomplish? A loud shrieking noise that only a shofar can make, this piercing and sharp noise. It would wake you up, but in a very disorienting way. And then this thud of pitchers breaking, and then torches with lights so that you couldn't see clearly what was going on. How many men are out there? What's happening? What's going on? And the 300 men that have encircled the Midianite camp, so that it was perceived that there were many more than there really were. And they shouted out this vibrant war cry, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon, which scared the Midianites. And so what happened? And the whole army of the Midianites ran and cried out and fled. They just took off in fear and disarray. They raised their swords against one another because it's dark. They couldn't see clearly what they were fighting. It's just chaos. So the fact that there were only 300 Israelites worked greatly in their favor. They fled far and wide, we're told, those brave Midianites. They not only started swinging their swords at one another and killing each other in panic, but they ran for it. So the other tribes of Israel kind of came out of hiding. These are people that had said before, we're not going to help you. You're on your own. And then they pursued the Midianites. And I think this also speaks something about Gideon's character. Instead of chastising these other, smaller tribes, Gideon doesn't say, hey, you guys are a little late to the party. We've done all the hard work here. So you don't get to come into any of the glory. Instead, he encourages them to fight the running Midianites and take part in the victory. Seize the enemy wherever you can. Be victorious along with me and my 300 men. This is the sign of a really great and godly leader. He can forgive the fact that most of these people wouldn't fight before, but now they kind of want to jump into the fray and help out. So it speaks a lot to Gideon's character right now. So they captured 2 Midianite princes, Oreb and Zeb, and killed them and bring Gideon these men's heads, which is, a prize for his amazing leadership. And, you know, that's just what they did in Old Testament times. It's really yucky, but that was a mark of respect and admiration, that your army would bring as their general the heads of your enemies, although to us it's quite disgusting. Different culture, different habits, we got to go with it. But at the end of chapter 7, this is a definite high point for our friend Gideon. He's the man who listened to God, asked him what he should do, and wound up with this amazing result, defeating the mighty Midianite army with only 300 men. But ladies, the story is far from over, as we're going to see next week. So come back and we're going to continue to see what we can learn from the ongoing life of Gideon